People of color are often underrepresented in media. POC Stock is changing that. Join us in capturing the faces and culture of Black, Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Natives. Are you a rockstar photographer? Sign up on our website to submit content and receive royalties. POC Stock, focusing on people of color. People of color are often underrepresented in media. POC Stock is changing that. Join us in capturing the faces and culture of Black, Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Natives. Are you a rock star photographer? Sign up on our website to submit content and receive royalties. POC Stock, focusing on people of color.
Welcome, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tony Effick, and I've got the honor of being your host tonight. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm a managing director at Google. I'm an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Engineering, and I also happen to be the founder of something called the Black and Brilliant Advocacy Network, an organization really centered on bringing equity to the workplace. But today happens to be the coalescence of two really important dates for us in our community, and I think in across the world. So, with Father's Day and Juneteenth falling on the same weekend this year, this will be an intimate and candid conversation amongst Black men about topics relevant to them today. And so we kind of really want to understand, some of the issues that we're dealing with today. But before going any deeper into this, I want to introduce my esteemed panel and give them a moment to talk a little bit about themselves. And panelists, I'd really love for you to kind of say a few words. So firstly, tell us your name, your occupation, and a little bit about your family, maybe, and the family you grew up in, just to kick us off. So over to you first, Chris.
Yeah, Chris.
I apologize. I'm sorry. Good evening. My name is Chris Thomas. I am from the defensive line. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the defensive line. And we started in May of last year, along with my son Solomon and my wife Martha. We're the co-founders, and our executive director is Ray Horst. And I've been married. Actually, yesterday was my 37th year of being married to my wife Martha. And unfortunately, I was on the road, so I have got to make sure I make up for that when I get home. But I was married by my father-in-law and brother-in-law, and I have two children, Ella, who was born April 1993, and Solly, who was born April 26 of 95. And unfortunately, Ella passed away in January of 2018. We'll get into more of that, but I reside in Coppell, Texas, suburb of Dallas, Texas, and I've been there for about 15 years now. So I'm proud to be a part of this panel. Thank you for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for sharing that, Chris. Chris, do you mind just talking a little bit about the family you grew up in as well, though? It's important.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So I grew up in Ohio, outside of Columbus, a place called Zanesville, Ohio, and I was the firstborn of my nuclear family. I have a younger brother and a younger sister. Unfortunately, my father was a Rolling Stone, so I was raised by my mother basically 80% of the adolescent life. But I do have quite a few half brothers and sisters because Papa was a Rolling Stone. So I do have a quaint and quite good grasp on the concept of aces. We'll get into that a little bit, but later. But yeah, so I'm the first of my family to attend and graduate from college. And my brother was actually an Olympic hurdler, and my sister works here in Atlanta at Delta. So that's my nuclear family.
Wow, you got sports in the blood there, Chris.
Absolutely.
For sure. You got sports in the blood. Steve, I'd love to hear a little bit from you as well. So if you don't mind sharing your name, your occupation. This is a POC Stock event, by the way, everyone. So we'll come back to that in a second. But share a little bit about your family. I've had the pleasure of meeting TJ. But talk about your family and then the family you grew up in. I know a little bit about that, but I'd love the audience to hear about it.
Sure. And I am Steve Jones, founder and CEO of POC Stock. And first of all, Chris, sorry for the loss that you and your family have gone through. I really can't imagine what that must feel like. So I'm hoping that we can use this conversation as part of the healing going forward. Myself, I am the proud father of 5. I have 3 boys and 2 girls. My wife and I have been together Wow, 19 years. We just celebrated 19 years together. 19 years married, 24 years together. Let me just be clear. It took 5 years for her to wear me down and get me across that, get me down the aisle, but the best move I've ever made. So, for me, I'm from the Caribbean. I was born in Barbados, and I am one of nine. Actually, I'm 8 of 9. I have one younger brother, and all of my siblings are older. My father was not necessarily a Rolling Stone, but he wasn't there as part of my growing up. So, my mother disappeared when I was 14. She left the house, and we never seen or heard from her again. So, I pretty much was raised by my oldest sister, Marcia, and also all of my friends, their mothers embraced me as well. So as I went to their house, they always made sure I was fed, always make sure I stayed out of trouble, and they treated me like I was their own son. So I never lacked for that sort of mother figure, or even a father figure for that matter. So, in the islands, we're not very affectionate in the way that Americans are affectionate. So I shower my kids with so much, so many hugs, so many kisses, and so much outward love. My family, my current, my oldest son is 28. My youngest is 11. And it's a wide range, and it's just, I could not imagine not having a big family. It feels so natural. When people hear I have 5 children, they're like, there's so many. I'm like, well, I come from 9, so I have more. I have more work to do. But I'll end there, and we can unpack some of that a little bit later. But being a dad is everything for me. Everything I do is really for building legacy for my children. So
it's amazing. Thank you both for sharing those stories, and obviously we're going to dig into more of that. And just so the audience knows, so I was born in West Africa, in Nigeria. I grew up in the UK. My father died when I was young. We had a tough time growing up, and for a lot of the time, like many people, we had a strong matriarch in our family who just made everything work, juggled multiple jobs, but we ate. We came out the other end, and and I'm going to dig into some of this because we all kind of have slightly fractured backgrounds. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma and what that means as a dad and how we handle that, because intergenerational trauma is a big part of it. But we'll come back to that. But when we first started talking about this, Steve, one of the questions that came into my head around all of this was, we're doing something around what it means to be a Black dad. This is the Black Dad Challenge. Now, one of the questions I want to ask is being a dad, or is there something distinct, unique, and maybe even more difficult, or just different from being a dad elsewhere? So it's a hard question. So I asked my kids this before I did this, but so Chris, let me go to you first, and then I'm going to come to you next, Steve. So Chris, over to you first.
Yeah, as I think about my life, I think about how I filter my experiences. And because I'm a Black male, my first and dominant filter is Black. So I've always seen myself as a Black dad. And I've always felt that it's more of a challenge for me to raise my kid than perhaps some of my best mates from corporate America who are white. Because there are a lot of things that they don't have to worry about, whether it's discrimination, whether it's racism, whether it's being concerned about being driving while Black or running while Black, and those kind of things. And I can always remember when our kids were young, like in the grade school time, I started giving that talk about the way they need to handle themselves. And I always felt like I wish I didn't have to do that, but I felt to keep them safe, it was necessary because, like I mentioned before, my father was a Rolling Stone. There were times he was around and he instilled certain things in me, but that's one thing he did instill in me, the fact that as a Black male, there are things that are going to be different for me than my white counterparts. He also still some things as relates to athletics, which we'll get into later, but that's something that I eventually then had to pass on to my kids because I didn't want them to encounter any of the issues, and I want to make life easier for them than it was for me. So that was a key part of how I thought of myself. And also I thought of myself as a Black dad, because growing up, high school, middle school, I didn't see my first African-American male teacher until I was in college. So I always felt like I had to overemphasize the importance of our heritage, our history, our culture, our tradition, our pride with our kids. From the time they could read, I was always giving them Black history facts, and there was a time when I got laid off when I was at Frito-Lay, and I ended up having to be a Mr. Dad or Mr. Mom or stay-at-home dad. And one of the practices I got into was putting quotes in their lunch every day. And it got to a point that even after I started going back to work, the kids still wanted that. I had to deliver it in a different way, but that providing that kind of heritage, that kind of tradition, that kind of Black love, I think it was because I've always thought myself as a Black male, as a Black dad. Now our household is a little different in that my wife is Caucasian. So I live in an interracial world. So I had to teach them the best of both worlds. And I think because of that, my kids were very resilient, very flexible, and they were able to navigate through social and cultural issues throughout the times they've lived in the U.S. as well as abroad. So as I think about the question, I always think of myself as filtering my way I raised my kids as a Black father, and making sure that they understood that they had to work twice as hard and be twice as seen to be able to be on equal footing to their counterparts.
That's so powerful, Chris. Thank you for that. I love that little thing about the quotes in the lunchbox.
Yeah,
we're going to come back to some of these little, I'm going to call them hacks for now, because they're like little life hacks. We'll come back to these little things that I think, because I want the audience to walk away from this with some very practical things that they can go away and do. And it's, it feels like you've thought really deeply about what it means to be a Black dad. So I really appreciate that. One of the thoughts that comes to my mind is this idea of being a dad and giving your kid roots and wings, because you want them to be super deeply grounded in what they are, so they have the resilience you talked about, but you want to give them the wings so they can fly, and you want them to know that wherever they go in the world, whatever they do, they've always got a place they can come back to. That's the roots piece, and so the resilience piece is really important. So Steve, I'd love to take the same question to you. So what's the difference? Is there a difference?
I think being a dad is always a difficult position, no matter which culture or race you come from, right? So being a dad is a dad. In our society, the mom is although I don't think mothers get as much praise as they should, they still get more praise than the father figure, right? And probably rightfully so. But being a Black dad, a lot of us, don't come from a home where we have that role model in the home, like some of our other cultures have. They have that blueprint in the home. So they're talking about finances, they're talking about vacations, they're going places, they're doing things that expands their worldview, where a lot of us, we have to learn just through life experiences, right? And it's a little different, because for me, growing up without a dad, I try to be everything that I think I would have wanted my dad to be for my kids, right? I grew up in a very, very tough neighborhood, and it wasn't really about, men being vulnerable or caring or affection. It was really Bed-Stuy in the early 80s and 90s was very, very rough. So no one wasn't really like caring. And I made sure that I don't, I will disagree with one thing, Chris, because I did hear the same kind of feedback about being twice as good. I make sure not to put that kind of pressure on my kids. And I totally understand it. I feel it. I get it. But I made a conscious effort. That's what I learned. I learned that as well. And then I made sure I just tell them to be the best of themselves that they can be, and not, because it's that perpetuates some of the trauma, having our kids trying to be twice as good when everyone else could just show up and be as good as they are. And we have our kids having to be twice as good. And I try to make sure I just have my kids do the best that they can. I worry about the same things. I have 3 boys. They're tall, dark, and I worry about the whole driving while Black. And, I talk to them about the rules of what happens if a cop pulls them over. I know they're beautiful, boys. They're very kind-hearted, but if you see them and they're big, and you're intimidated just because they're dark and their outward appearance, you'll never know that these are the most smart and beautiful boys you're ever going to meet. If you take 2 seconds to have a conversation with them, they're not a threat to you. And it's just, it's a constant worry about things like that. I make sure not to pass on a lot of what I grew up with on them, like the ultra macho sort of attitude. I let them be themselves, and I think that's the difference. I think a lot of our other counterparts, they just get to, any dad to go through, challenging teenagers and things like that, but they don't have to worry about the other 10 or 20 things that we have to worry about. They have a blueprint. They know what it's like to be in a really good, stable household. They know where their next meals are coming from in a lot of cases. And, when we grew up with single parent household, sometimes those things are not clear. You have all that worry and that stress all the time, so.
Thank you, Steve, appreciate that. It's interesting though, because I think one of the things we're finding now is that I think maybe we on this panel have a lot more in common, but then a bunch of, there's the new generation of people who are maybe more stable, more structured. Your children, my children, Chris's children, etc.
Yeah.
And so, and then maybe growing up in more affluence. So let's recognize there's a whole bunch of people in the audience who might have a slightly different background from us, but we'll come back to that in a second. You talked a lot about, both of you, and this is a topic that I find really fascinating, about the things we inherit from our own families that we then pass on. It was interesting a while back when Denzel was doing the junket to, the press round to talk about when he released the movie Fences with Viola Davis, an amazing film. If you haven't seen that, about family, that is just like an amazing tour de force by that whole cast and by Denzel. But when he was doing the interview, he talked about the pain that fathers pass on to their sons. And I heard that, and he talks really eloquently about it, and I'm not doing it justice now. And I kind of started digging into this. And one of the things that I walked away thinking is that Black people around the world, I'm not just talking about here, around the world, my roots are in Nigeria. That's a whole country that's been, suffering from trauma. But there's trauma everywhere, okay? And not everyone has trauma, let's get it right. But we all have some kind of inner hurt. The inner child of us has been damaged in some shape or form. We didn't kind of grow up all necessarily in this perfect, even if you came from privilege sometimes. So we pass on parent to child, particularly father to son, as Denzel said, mother to daughter, and some of these unresolved traumas become intergenerational curses. They're things that we carry around with us. And sometimes you don't even know you're carrying it around with you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of, when you find that there is something that you talked already about it, Steve, but you found that there's things that you just do that you're automatically passing on to your children. Have you been aware of some of this stuff, some of these intergenerational things, and said, no, I'm not going to do that? And what would you say to everyone else who's encountering their weakness, their wounds? Because you either deny them, you accept them and work on them. You can accept your weakness and find a way around it, or you can change. You can actually change. I'll start with you, Chris, and just see if you've got any thoughts about that. Because one generation has to be the generation that faces that, and then deals with it, and then doesn't pass it on.
Yeah, the whole trauma piece is very keen to me, and I believe, aside from the comment I made about them working twice as hard and being twice as good, that's one thing which I totally agree, Steve. As I think about it now, it could create huge trigger, huge stress, undue stress. But as I think about, trauma for myself personally, I try to make sure my kids didn't experience any of the traumas that I experienced growing up. So one of the things I try to share with people is that I am the son of high school dropouts, I am the survivor of racial, physical, and sexual abuse. So one of the things that I tried to do out of that is to make sure I created an environment for my kids that none of that existed. So education was always a priority. We always tried to find a way to learn not just African culture, but all different types of culture. And we always try to travel around the world to just so they can see different parts, whether it was Spain, whether it was Japan, whether it was Australia, Thailand, just so they can learn as much, because I wanted their mind to expand so they could be independent thinkers, they could be problem solvers, they could be brilliant in their own field, whatever it was. But the other thing is, as it relates to, the abuse that I went through, the sexual and racial abuse, I tried to find a way to make sure that they were in environments that they could thrive, and that, and like most people who are sexually abused, I was abused by somebody close to my family. So I always had an antenna up to make sure that they weren't exposed to that. Because out of that trauma, I ended up trying, and this is before I understood, because I grew up in grew up in a Black household, we couldn't spell mental health. So I didn't know anything about therapy or meditation or journaling. I mean, mental health for me was going in to do the dishes. And so I didn't know anything at all. So although I didn't have the right language, as our kids were growing up, we did try to make sure that they expressed themselves, how they were feeling. We tried to make sure that they, own those feelings, and that it was okay for them to be vulnerable. And I think that helped a great deal, not obviously enough to the point where, unfortunately, Ella experienced depression and ended up dying. But I tried to make sure that that environment was there so that they could find a way to take care of themselves. But I didn't, and that's why I want to make sure they took care of themselves, because I tried to take care of myself by self-medicating. And I ended up trying to solve my problems in the bottom of a bottle. So I tried to find a way to make sure that my kids could talk to me, that they had the support they needed, that they had to go to therapy, they go to therapy, just give them all the things that I didn't have so that they would be the opposite of me. And so I don't know if I answered your question directly, but as I think about trauma, I thought about the things I didn't want my kids to experience.
Absolutely.
Tried to find a way to learn as much as I could about parenting, about, being a father, a coach. And one of the things I always try to do is always try to find a way to have an open conversation about how can I be better. Now, with that said, I was still not as good as my wife, because she found a way to be a little more cerebral. I was still some of that old spare the rod, spoil the child kind of concept, although we never spanked our kids, but still, I still had a little ways to go. But
you're clearly a man who's been through an amazing journey. Oh, I don't again, better reverb here. You've been through an amazing journey. I love the vulnerability you're showing here. I'm just going to pause for a second. Steve, do you want to take the same question and talk about this intergenerational trauma? You've touched on it a little bit with the work twice as hard. What things have you consciously decided that I'm not passing on, or recognize these were weaknesses, these are traumatic things that you didn't want to pass on?
Sure. I think I like everything Chris said, and I even appreciate the fact that he shared that much, because that I can totally connect and relate to a lot of what he just said. And there are things in the way that I grew up, and I try to do both. I try to give the kids the benefit of some of the things I went through, good, bad, or indifferent. And then I tried, they obviously are not living the life that I lived. They don't, we're in a nice neighborhood, doing a lot better than I did when I was growing up. So they don't have a lot of the challenges that I grew up with. So I try to make sure that I don't, I want them to be mentally tough, to be able to handle situations. There's a lot that I grew up with where everything was handled, with these and not with this, so I want to make sure they're able to think through and problem solve, and navigate through any situation. I'm an entrepreneur, so you drop me anywhere and I'm going to figure it out. And one of the things that I want to make sure my kids do is, I instill the sense of them to figure things out, instead of getting angry. And, that's one thing. I grew up where everything was handled that way, well, not everything, but there's always a chance that something is going to go that route. And I make sure I didn't put that on them. I tell them my stories about, when I was younger, me and my brother had one pair of pants and one pair of shoes, and we both couldn't go out at the same time with one shoe. I make jokes of how I grew up, so that
you can laugh at it now. You can laugh at it now, but it's like, that's part of it.
But I do try to make sure I give them the best of, because that, if you look at how we're talking about how we grew up, we come from certain circumstances that our kids now don't have to go through, right? We went through those. There was a quote I saw on social media where it says that tough times breeds tough men, and then tough men raise soft children, and those soft children create hard times, which then create. So it's like, I want to make sure that my kids are mentally tough, but they don't have to not appreciate all of the hard work that my wife and I have poured into them with the school and the education and the comfortable lifestyle. When up until the time they were 6 to 8 years old, we made sure that every Christmas gift they got, they had to give away one. Like, we made sure that they appreciated what they have by knowing their position relative to people who didn't have as much, right? So we make sure to instill things like that, so they're not just all about me. I grew up in New York. It was always a me. Everybody fighting for their piece. No, it's like you're connected to things. What you do matters. I instill a sense of pride with the Jones name, because I let them know early on we're building a Jones legacy for them and their children. So they have that in their heads as well. So I didn't grow up with any legacy. So,
You started one, Steve. So for sure. I want to actually dig into this. I want to come in a second, Chris. I want to talk about the defensive line. But before we get to that, we've touched on it a couple of times in this dialogue. There are kind of, if you think about the spectrum of functional versus dysfunctional families, dad has to play a role in that, in a functional family. Yeah, not in every form. I mean, there's many different types of families out there, so I recognize that. But when I think about the type of family I'm in, the type of family you guys are in, and the notion of fatherhood that maybe we're talking about here, I wonder if there are little hacks, rituals, traditions, stories, things that you bring to the table. So Chris, you talked earlier on about the quotes in the lunchbox. Steve, you just talked about giving a gift away when you get a gift at Christmas. Are there things that we could share with our audience that they could take into their families as dads, in order to move their family from, to be more functional, or if it's dysfunctional to functional? So I'll give an example. So growing up in the tradition I was in, children were meant to be seen but not heard. We were not supposed to talk back. There was no open conversation. we just it was monologues. There was no debate. And so in other words, what that meant was that, many of us didn't get a chance to really express our feelings. Many of us, someone said, "How you doing?" You said, "Fine." Okay, so there's about 5 words that described how you felt. You never said sad. You said, joyful, elated. It was just the vocabulary of emotions was very, very limited. And also, I felt that meant that many families have blind spots that they bury for years. And then it's only when people get much older that these things start to come out, and it can be hurtful, and it's too late. And some of these are irreversible. So one of the traditions we started in our family is this idea of a family council. So, the children get a chance to put the agenda together and chair the meeting. They can decide what we're going to talk about. Somebody else takes the actions and the notes, which is just good training anyways, just because you could be in business one day. And I think what's really fascinating about this is that you hear things you didn't expect to hear. Not offensive things, but actually insightful things, because if the meeting is kind of conducted in a certain type of way, then you start getting some real richness that exposes blind spots and puts the sunlight where sunlight should be. And so this is a thing that I found to be very useful. Everyone enjoys it. We don't always keep to it, the regularity we'd like to, but I found it to be very helpful. You both shared a couple of hacks, if you like it already. I wonder if there's any other rituals or traditions or stories you have in your families. I'll start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I love the one Steve talked about at Christmas. We had a similar type of ritual where Christmas Day, we would go down and serve at a place called Austin Street, a soup shelter in downtown Dallas, and we would do that before we would open up our Christmas gifts. Now that got a little more difficult as the kids got older with AU basketball, but when they were in middle school, grade school, that was a tradition that we really enjoyed. One of my favorite traditions is one that my wife and I, when I was in town, I traveled a lot. And I was in the consumer goods industry, but whenever I was home, we always ate dinner together. And it was a meal together. There was no devices. It was just us sitting and talking together. And if the kids had friends over, they can come and eat with us, but they would have to sit together with us, follow the rules, and we would have conversations. And to me, that was one of the most rewarding rituals that we did as a family, because it brought unity, it brought closeness. We were able to relate with each other. We would tell stories. We would share things that happened in our family. And then I didn't really understand or appreciate it as much until after Ella passed away. And one of her friends came and said, Mr. Thomas, one of the best times of my life was having dinner with you, watching you cook, watching you guys work together as a family, as a couple. My wife and I cook together, clean together. You as a family sit down together, talking about things, life, and all that. That was one of my favorite times, being able to do that. And I just took it for granted because we just did that all the time. But when her friend said that, it's like, wow. Just because she said, my family never sat down together to eat. And if we did, we were all had our own separate agenda. So it was sort of like, it was just like a really just like it's not religious moment, but it was just special. It was just a great way to be together and enjoy each other's company. So that was probably my favorite ritual. And I think the kids as well, although we did make sure that when we gave them allowance, they had to do chores before they got their allowance, but that, I'm sure that was.
Over to you, Steve. That was amazing.
I love it. And Chris, I can absolutely agree. And that is one of the most beautiful times. And I will say this, that is one of the only positives that came out of the pandemic, because we were all in the same house together. This is before my son moved out. And we had dinner, we had breakfast together, every single day. We always had the same no device rule. So I'm so in sync with you right now, Chris. I don't want to repeat everything you said. I'm just saying I totally agree. The only thing I would add as a life hack, and this is going to be whether you're a Black father or not, is talk about money and talk about health with each other. Those are two of the things that I find that we don't talk about enough in the Black community that are so destructive. And these are things that other people talk about in their households, and it makes their families richer, not just wealthy, but just rich in terms of knowledge. I have a good friend of mine whose wife passed away because she had a condition that could have been treated had someone else who passed away in their family passed that medical information back and forth. And I'm not, obviously not victim blaming. It's a tragedy all around. But if we talk about some of these things openly, you'll find out, hey, sickle cell runs in my family. Hey, diabetes runs in my family. Hey, this runs in my family. Oh, this person has that too. And on the other end of the coin, I talk to my kids about everything from investments to how checks work, how checking accounts work. And it may seem rudimentary to other cultures, but that's something we never grow up hearing. Like, I didn't know about bills until I had them of my own. I didn't know how things got paid or didn't get paid. I just, So just talk about finances, everything that we are learning as professionals, as successful business people, as entrepreneurs, and just, successful people in your own right. Share that information with your children as early as possible. Let them go out in the world so they can make good financial decisions and good decisions about their health. Black men, you have to drag us to a doctor, and that's not good. So, when those are sorts of things I would talk about, in addition to what Chris said. Talk about finance and health issues openly in the community would be a much richer place.
Yeah, I so much agree with that. The financial literacy piece is such a that's a game changer. A neighbor, a friend of mine, got a bunch of kids in the community to do a financial literacy course where they were investing in stocks, and my kids got into it as well. They're just throwing a few dollars here and there. But the idea of starting to get them to understand how the stock market works, how savings work. And then frequently, my son asked me, we got into a conversation about mortgages and banks. And I said, this house isn't mine, this is I'm still paying this. This is the bank's. Really? And we had some really interesting conversations about, okay, so how so when you put money in the bank, they take that money and okay, is that how it works? And then we got some really interesting conversations around all of that. But you start to give them an advantage and a comprehension in life that, and we call this stuff in the Black and Brilliant Advocacy Network, the cheat codes. You don't know the cheat codes until frequently it's too late. That's the stuff you wish you knew 5 years before. So if we can get them to know this stuff before they get onto the field, that's just that makes a heck of a difference. And so sometimes one of the things we will do as well, in addition to our family councils, is dinner time is really important for me. Just the ability to sit together, no screens, and pick a topic. We talk about, sometimes we'll be like, because sometimes you can just sit at the table and say, how was your day at school and how was your day at work? That's great. We do all of that. We get out of the way, but then we'll pick a topic. I mean, my daughter loves debate, and she was doing some stuff on kind of like social medicine, state-sponsored healthcare systems versus, and we had a conversation about it. I had experience of having grown up in Europe, and I could talk about that, and I've had this experience. And so we had an interesting conversation. And we had a conversation about, should people who are more privileged support people who are less privileged? And are you willing to give some of your money to others? And people start to form points of view, opinions. That is the essence, I think, of what an education is. It's not that the fact you can remember facts and figures, it's the fact that you can express yourself. It's the fact you can form an opinion. It's the fact that you can get into a debate. It's the fact you can defend yourself and stand up in a room of people and, and put your point of view across. So I think the dinner table, and I don't mean, a tray in front of the television, but the dinner table, it doesn't matter how small the table is or how big the table is, but sit around and have open conversations. So that's one of the things. But I wanted to pivot at this point, and the defensive line, you're wearing the t-shirt, so thank you for rocking that today for us, Chris. Appreciate that. But there's a really powerful story behind all of this, and I'd like Ella's name has come up a couple of times in this conversation, and I know you're a man who is comfortable being vulnerable and sharing your experience. But I'd love for you to maybe talk about the defensive line, its mission, why, and then could you kindly share Ella's story for us?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. As I mentioned before, I didn't know much growing up about mental health and suicide. Like I said before, I couldn't spell mental health, but January 23rd of 2018, after a bout with depression and domestic abuse as well as sexual abuse, Ella took her life. And out of that pain, we wanted to create some type of purpose so that no other family went through the kind of pain we went through. And I had a pastor say one time, when you're given a mess, create a message. So we wanted to find a way to honor Ella. And we created the defensive line, a world where no young person of color dies by suicide. And our mission is to end the epidemic of youth suicide, especially of people of color, by changing the way we communicate and connect about mental health. And we called it the defensive line because it's bigger than Ella. Particularly for people of color, suicide rates are 2 to 3 times more for people of color than than the Caucasian population. And it's a huge issue. One of the areas where we do a lot of our work, because part of the defensive line is providing suicide prevention training, mental wealth training for middle schools and high schools, for the leaders of middle schools and high schools. And one of the areas we do this work is in Vegas. And overall, and across the US, under the age of 24, the second leading cause of death is suicide. The second leading cause of death is suicide for under the age of 24. In Vegas, it's the number one cause of death. So as we were going into Clark County schools in Vegas and talking about this, we've realized that it's important enough to create this program that's called the defensive line, because we want people to understand the myths that exist out there. Defend against the myths, defend against the stereotypes, defend against the fact that, that people don't know the signs of what's going on for people who are at risk. And so that's why we call the defensive line versus Ella story, because it's bigger than Ella. Unfortunately, Ella, was in so much pain, she took her life. And I always try to tell people that Ella's death doesn't define her, because she was a brilliant athlete. She was a brilliant person. She was a human narrator. She had charisma, she had leadership. She just had some demons that she didn't know how to fix. And I did not help her. And I wanted other parents to not go through what I went through, so they could know the warning signs from a talk, move, behavior. We do a lot of work with other nonprofits like American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and they've got some great tools. So does Mental Health America, so does Dak Prescott's Faith Fight Finish, and other folks who work with like Born This Way for the LGBTQ. We want parents and leaders that know the signs of these kids that are at risk. And unfortunately, it's getting worse and worse for our kids of color. So we want the leaders to know this and give them the tools. We walk them through a program called the D Lines, where people don't ignore the gut, listen for the signs, interact with people who are at risk, name the concern that you have for this individual, evidence the concern for this person, and then create a supportive environment, creating an environment of trust, creating an environment where kids of color don't have to go through microaggressions, macroaggressions, where they don't have to worry about, people using their unconscious implicit bias against them. So they're either suspended or expelled, or they feel like they're not worthy of anything. So they take things on their, they don't practice self-care. So that's what we're all about. And we're making some big differences in Vegas and North Texas. We're going to expand where Solly's at in New Jersey. We're working with companies like ESPN and CBS's of the world to get our story out there, to get the training in the hands of people that can make a difference and save lives. So out of the tragedy of losing Ella, we really believe we're saving lives. We really believe we're making a difference. And now Martha, Solomon, Ray, Sandy, one of our workers, and myself are all about what we call heart work, where we're out there trying to make an influence and keep people on this earth and give them the chance to be able to thrive versus just survive. So that's what it's all about. All right,
Wow.
long-winded over that.
No, I mean, every single word you just said there had emotion and power in it. So thank you for sharing that. And Chris, just thank you for just being so vulnerable, and you speak passionately and with love for your daughter. So I just, you've clearly, you and your family were incredibly hurt by this, but you seem to have come out stronger, because if you could have responded in all sorts of ways. One of my favorite books is it's a pretty dark book. Is a guy called Viktor Frankl. He survived Auschwitz, and his book is Man's Search for Meaning. And he says something like this. I'm going to paraphrase: everything can be taken from a man, but one thing: your attitude to your suffering. Your attitude to your situation, and how you respond to it. And it feels to me like you and your family held arms together, and you said, look, we could, you're a man of means, your family, you could have just donated somewhere, but you decided to set something up and do something about it, to be the change you want to see in the world. So I congratulate you, as well as commiserating, and put my hat out to you as well. But I wanted to keep on the theme. Steve, I'll come back to you in a second. I just want to keep on this theme. One of the things I quote Viktor Frankl. I'm a big believer in this idea about stories, and the stories we tell ourselves. Because let's say, for example, I'm the child of immigrants. I grew up in the underprivileged background. That could actually be seen as a really negative, poor story. But you flip that story around, And all of a sudden, the people that came before me were heroes. These were people who left their land against all the odds, made a foundation in another country, set up a family, learned a new culture, established themselves, and created a jumping off board. So I think stories are very powerful. And I note when looking through your website, Chris, that one of the treatments you have uses the power of stories in healing, which is storytelling and advocacy. And, this is about talking openly and honestly about what these internal experiences are, in order to take away shame. Shame is a really important word, I'm going to come back to that in a second as well. And therefore take away stigma. We as a community have a lot of face. We have to deal with shame a lot. We have to always show, I won't say the bright side, but, ourselves in the best light. You have to be out there in the right kind of way. And then the suffering remains silent. Can you talk a little bit about that treatment, storytelling and advocacy, and where that came from, and why that's so powerful?
Yeah, so part of the storytelling is, aside from talking about Ella and the things she went through and how we're trying to make a difference in our trainings, we're also trying to talk about suicide. We're also trying to talk about mental health, because you think about mental health, 1 out of 4 people have been diagnosed with some kind of mental health condition. And I always say that if it's 1 out of 4, it's actually 4 out of 4, because if someone in your house has got some kind of mental health condition, somebody has to be helping them. So it has some kind of impact on that whole family. So it's impacting a lot of us. And a lot of times, the number one reason why people don't seek help is because of stigma. And I feel the more we talk about it, the more we normalize the conversation, the more we equip people with language about what mental wealth looks like. What does someone at risk and pain look like? What does suicide prevention look like? So for Martha and Solomon and I, suicide prevention is hope. It's about telling the story of how we can help each other get through this crisis. And telling our story helps them understand that it normalizes the conversation. One of the things we do as we go to some of these conferences, we talk about our story, we talk about the D lines, and we ask people to name those who have either they know somebody directly or indirectly that have been touched by suicide. At least 55 to 6% of the room stands up. So this is happening, and there's nothing to be ashamed about. So we believe by telling our story, by Solomon talking about how he was in a dark place after Ella's. He was in his second year at the NFL, he's with the Niners, and he talks about how he was having suicidal thoughts. 6'3", 280-pound behemoth. He was feeling vulnerable. He didn't know what to do. And it took his boss coming to him and say, look, Solomon, you're not yourself. You're exhibiting these signs that I'm concerned about. I want you to go get help. Gave Solomon the permission to get out of that funk, out of that black cloud, to go get help, to go get therapy. And so by him talking about it, it lets people know who aren't professional players say, man, if he can raise his hand and say, I need help, and I can be vulnerable, and I can cry, and I can say I was suicidal, I can get help. And so we feel like talking about it really creates normalization, and it helps other folks realize, hey, I was thinking about this. I have a friend who was thinking about this. Let's talk about how we handle this together. And so we have the conversation, and we give people tools like from the D lines, from American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, from Mental Health America, and so that they can then help others not experience the pain and the end outcome that Ella experienced. So it's a lot of times it's hard to tell the story, because each day I tell it, it's different. Some days it's easier than others, but we really feel that by telling our story, we save lives, and we normalize the conversation, and we reduce the stigma. And it's really particularly important, we think, as we expand our work into the Black churches, because it's not faith or therapy, it's faith and therapy. It's all three. And that's what we're trying to make sure people understand, so that we can get this, suicide's a white thing, or only white people go to therapists. That's BS. It's for everybody. It's like, as you're exercising your muscles, exercise your brain. Go to the therapist. Write your journals down. Do meditation. Do art therapy. Go out in the woods. I mean, whatever your therapy is, but practice it daily. it's so important, I think.
I love that. I love that. And yeah, if you're willing to go to the gym to exercise your body, all of those things, meditation, therapy, all of those things are things I found to be useful as well. And so I appreciate that. Steve, to some degree, a lot of people have gone through hardship the last couple of years in the pandemic, not quite to the level of Chris, but sometimes maybe, we've all heard of, people lost their lives. We've seen families break up. We've seen, we've seen suicides. I have a friend who committed suicide during this time period. So there's been a lot of tragedy in the last couple of years. I'm hoping also that some people found some blessings, some silver linings in all of this. I wonder, in this upheaval of the last couple of years, what lessons or blessings have you taken away from this period of time? Have you had in your family?
Quite a few. My family has had our share of losses. Lost my sister last year. There's a lot of impact that has been had, for families like mine all around the country, all around the world. So there's been a lot of that. But, through some of this pain, a lot of us, I like what you said, Chris, about taking a mess and creating a message. I think a lot of us have found a voice. And one of the things that I see that hasn't reverted back is that I see a lot more Black people being themselves, see a lot of more LGBT, queer and trans people being themselves. I see people taking more of an opportunity to work on their mental health, instead of shuffling back and forth to offices, 40 hours a week, being as productive, working from home. I see a lot of people now are comfortable in that space because they don't have to, a lot of us, a lot of our Caucasian counterparts never actually met us. They worked with us for years, but they never met us, the true us. And now on the Zoom calls, I'm hearing you're starting to see a little bit more of who we are. No, we didn't change. We just feel a little bit more comfortable being ourselves. So now you show up as yourself and we accept you as who you are. Now we show up as ourselves and we want to be accepted as who we are. And I think that to me is one of the positives. I love seeing more women in power positions. That's always a joy for me to see. And I just love to see more of us just being more expressive about who we are. And I think once you start to really meet each other and start to see the beauty in each other, I think that's how we start to come together. It seems like we're very apart in this country because we don't see differences as positives anymore. But yeah, no, I think a lot of what I've seen has to do with just people finding their voices. A lot more entrepreneurs, a lot more people standing up and really speaking up. And I want to see more of that.
Yeah, amazing. I'm going to ask one last question, then we're going to go to questions from the audience. We talked a lot about being fathers, what that means, but it also happens to be Juneteenth. This is Juneteenth weekend. And so, and I dug deep into this history, and there's just so much that hasn't been told. And as one of my personal heroes, everyone has heard of Frederick Douglass, but has everyone heard of I.D.B. Wells? Has everyone heard about all of the heroes during Reconstruction and all of the amazing sacrifices and the things that people did and the tragedies and all of those amazing things? So someday some of this stuff is going to come to light in more ways. I'm an optimist, a foolish optimist. I don't know, and I always hope, and I kind of believe in that Martin Luther King quote, the arc of history bends upwards, ever upwards. So I'm mangling that, but I think we know is that things get better is the essence of that. So some people would say the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that you just said what you just said, Steve, about the visibility, the fact people can have these conversations. Some people would say that this is the golden age for the Black community. Some people would say.
I agree.
We've got things that we've never had. We're in places we've never been and having conversations that we've never had. But some other people might say this is the dark age. Is that, we see police brutality. The statistics still don't tell a great story. Which side are you guys on? First you, Chris. Golden age or dark age?
Wow. Oh, I love that question. And I think we've come so far, but I also think we have so far to go. So I don't think it's either. I think we're further along than we need to be, but I still think there's issues we got to deal with. I mean, when you got 3 blacks being shot each day, 1,000 a year, when you got voter suppression happening, when you got a new type of lynching going on here in America, we got to find a way to get beyond that. Now we're not where we were back, the days when it was like blatant racism and all that, but we're suffering from so many different types of vicarious and implicit and unconscious racism, and like the microaggressions that happen, the 5 microaggressions a day for the average black person. So I like to find a way to get us to what I'll call the platinum age, where we're not always the last to get served, where we're totally free and we're able to embrace each other's culture and race in a way where we are truly diverse and we are truly leveraging and working with each other. But right now we're not. I still think that we have a ways to go. We've made progress, but there's still a ways to go before we get to the platinum level, which is where I think we should settle on, not the golden level.
Chris, you just raised the bar right there. You went platinum. Steve.
I'm gonna raise the bar to vibranium from Wakanda. How about that? No, I do see all the things going on in the world, and I think I said it in an interview before where we talked about how my coming from the Caribbean allows me to see I can be here, but I can kind of see it from outside perspective. And for everyone who sees the racism, the problems, the brutality, I see all those things too, and it's a problem, and I definitely want to fix it. But I'm also somewhat of an optimist in a sense that you put me anywhere, I'm going to create something positive or something beautiful out of it, right? So I see all of the turmoil, but from that turmoil, we created all of these chief diversity officers, all these diversity conversations, opportunities, more opportunities for us to do business and, be elevated at work, and to, the Crown Act where women are now can wear their hair anywhere and not be discriminated against, all the AAPI movement, all of that came out of this mess. That's the message that came out of this mess. So I'm always looking for how to take those tragedies and turn it into a triumph. Like that's just how I'm wired. So I definitely see those things. I'm concerned for my kids. I'm concerned about the shootings. I'm concerned about, all the things going on with our government. I'm concerned with all those things, but then my mind kicks in and say, that's the state of play. How do I then leverage that and use that to still be successful? Even if the cards are stacked against me, I'm still going to try to find a way to win. So that's just how I'm wired.
I love that. I love that. I want to build on some of that and give it maybe a perspective that's unique to me. I will say I've been Black on 3 continents. I was born in Africa, grew up in Europe, and I live in America, and I've worked around the world. And I think one of the things I'm really excited about right now is just the connectivity I'm seeing in the global Black community in the ways I've never seen before. Because growing up, all of my heroes growing up were African Americans. When I put the TV on, that's who I watched. There's the music, everything, every sports hero, whatever. But what I see right now is that we have Black British actors in Hollywood, like Idris Elba. We have people in New York dancing to Afro beats. We have people traveling, connecting, and doing business in different ways. I'm excited about that. We never had that connectivity before. So I think for me, that points to somewhat of a golden age. So I'm excited about that. Again, there's a hopeless optimist, always hoping that things are going to get a bit better. But that's kind of driven me. I just wanted to take a couple of questions coming from the audience. So the first one, and I think you talked a little bit about this already, Chris, but I wouldn't mind you diving deeper. How do Black fathers talk to their families about well-being in this climate? I think you probably have to define well-being a bit there. How do Black fathers talk about well-being? And I think take that as a negative or positive in terms of well-being.
I think you're talking about well-being in the sense of the brain is like any other organ in your body. You got to take care of it. You got to make sure that you're constantly making sure you're taking care of yourself, and you focus on the elements that really help raise your level of serotonin, which helps drive connectivity with other people. You're working with, trying to build relationships, and that you're always conscious of the fact that you got to find a way to always take care of yourself, your whole body, not just physical or mental, it's both. So I really think that's part of it. All other pieces, knowing the language as relates to mental health and doing some research, whether you go to Mental Health America's website, the Defensive Line's website, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's website, there are great tools there on how to deal with conversations, how to deal with, the different types of issues as it relates to mental health, mental illness. So there are great tools out there to dig into, but to really have a conscious, intentional mindset that you're going to focus on improving your mind and your body is, I think, a key piece. And having candid discussions about how people are feeling. One of the great tools I love is this feeling wheel. Instead of your kid just saying, I feel okay, there's this feeling wheel, I feel frustrated, or I feel aggravated, or I feel joyous. I mean, that feeling wheel gets real specific about how you're feeling, and you keep peeling that onion back and having a real thorough and authentic conversation, not just a superficial veneer conversation with your kids and your friends.
Wow. Steve, do you want to build on that one?
Nope. Chris, that was perfect.
landed. Okay,
that landed perfectly. Yeah.
It's funny though. I would just say though that point is so important. It's just like, even as adults, many of us don't know actually how to express how we feel. Many of us don't know how to express how we love. Many of us don't know how to express what frustrates us, because many of us don't actually know who we actually are, because we haven't had the space, the conversations, those dinner table conversations, or those private conversations where you get into what is it that makes you tick. We didn't make who we were. But we can make who we want to be. So that's the optimist in me again. It's this idea that I do believe life is a thing a project that you can take some control of it, because you can be in the gutter and still look at the stars.
I found that years ago. A friend of mine who was a cancer survivor. She was one of the most jolly, happy, upbeat people in the world. She was laughing on her way in and out of chemo. And I never knew how she can pull that from inside with everything she's going. It's not abstract, like something going across the world. This is a war going on in her own body, and she was just such a beautiful spirit, just so lively, and it would amaze me, and that helped me to realize sometimes, if you're not happy with yourself, if you're not content, if you're not accepting of the things you can control and the things you can't, and you work on the things you can change and the other things you accept as it is what it is, you kind of fight a war inside, and you can't ever be settled and comfortable and in your own skin if you're not even, if that battle is raging. So some things if you're tall, if you're dark, if you have certain things that you're not happy about, you have to just accept that's the whole person, that's the whole you, and there's no one else like you out of the 7.8 billion people. You're just one of one, so it's just, it takes you a long time. We can't expect kids to really know how to do that, because like you said, some adults are still uncomfortable in our own skin, so that affects our ability to form that well-being as well for me. So I didn't want to go after Chris after that wonderful, eloquent statement he just made, but that's the only thing I would try to add to it is just find out who you are and be comfortable with your differences, because those differences are actually attributes and not negatives. Those are the things that make you special. Those are the things that make you who you are. So.
And isn't that one of the main jobs of a dad as well, and a parent's full stop, is to help a child get to that point as quickly as possible?
Yeah, as quickly as possible, because the quicker you can solve that in yourself, then you start to show up in the world differently. If you're wrestling with those things inside, you may not reach as far. You may not go for some things that you want because you're feeling that insecurity. You're feeling, hey, I'm not good enough. I'm too tall. I'm too short. I didn't come from this background. Why should I try? I'm going to fail. But when you settle that inside, you start to say, okay, let me give it a shot. What's the worst that could happen? Start feeling comfortable in your own skin. The earlier your kids can feel comfortable in their own skin and you can help them as parents do that, the more productive adults they'll be.
Isn't there something also just, I'm going to go back to the questions in a second, but there is something about the archetype. When I think about the archetype of a Black dad, I think about, and I'm playing around with a stereotype I even have in my own head about this strong guy who's taking care of business, who's a provider. And, but there's another element to this as well. This is the engaged dad. I don't mean like a Black dad isn't engaged. Black dads have always been engaged. I mean in terms of being able to have conversations about feelings, emotions, who you really are, what made you who you are, vulnerability. Vulnerability isn't weakness. Vulnerability is actually strength, by the way.
It's a superpower.
It's a superpower. And because it means you can be open, you can accept and take hurt, but you can stand up from it. And you can then also strong enough to be able to shake it off and then renew and strengthen. So I think part of what I'm interested in is how do you get to that point with your child, and how do we also kind of tackle this notion that yes, you can be a provider, but you can also be this other type of emotionally engaged, vulnerable person. It's almost the antithesis of what the stereotype we have in our heads. You can jump in here, Steve, if you want, and then over to Chris.
I was just going to say quickly, it's a process. It's not a one-shot deal. My oldest son will tell you I was less vulnerable than my youngest son will tell you. It was an evolution within myself to be able to then be that for my kids. And when I look at vulnerability, I think we all protect our heart because that's where we think the feelings are, right? So there's an armor around our heart. No one wants to get their feelings hurt. So we develop this armor to protect ourselves, right? So vulnerability means you're bearing yourself to allow the possibility that what you're saying is going to land on someone a certain way, or they may have a reaction to it. And, you know, so when you're able to just be who you are and say, this is my life story. I went through A, B, and C, and all of these things, good, bad, or indifferent, made me who I am today. You know, like you said, you can tell the story of, hey, I came from this country and we were poor and with this, or no, my family made the brave trek to that. It's all about the storytelling. Vulnerability is about the storytelling. It's how you share, it's how open you are. And my kids come and tell me all kinds of things that I would not have been able to tell my parents or any of the elders when I was growing up. And we had the same vocabulary. How you doing? I'm good. You know, or with the same monologue, and like you weren't able to share those things. So my kids share a lot with my wife, and they share a lot with me. They're different shares, but you know, we have that sort of open dialogue. That's how we know how they think. That's how we know how they feel, what their interests are, so we can support them. If we don't know and we don't have those dialogues, we wouldn't know. You know, our job is to support them in the things they love. You know, if they're not comfortable to tell us those things, if they start to figure things out, who are they going to go to? Their friends, you know, blind leading the blind. So, you know, as leaders of our household, we have to be there to help support them in their decision making, you know, and that takes vulnerability, you know, for us telling them, hey, you know, we didn't figure this out until we were 20. We're still trying to figure it out now. Like my wife talked to our kids like that. No, we're not perfect. You know, you'll have to sort some of this out with your therapist one day. You know, so we joke with them about that because it was an evolution for us to get some of this right. You know, parents are not perfect. You know, so.
Wonderful, wonderful. Chris, do you wanna?
60 seconds. I'll just say, you said the word archetypical dad, and the first thing that came to my mind was, I don't, for those of you who've seen this, the drama series, This Was Us, I think of Randall. I just think of somebody who was always trying to find a way to grow himself, always be in touch with himself, always trying to find a way to love himself and also love his family at the same time, and was always trying to find a way to search for growth. And he embraced therapy, he embraced, you know, adopting other kids, he embraced just trying to find a way to continue to grow in his own skin. And I just think of that as, when you say archetypical dad, that just came to my mind because he was in tune with his feelings, his emotions, his vulnerability, and he was no less a man than anybody else. So that just came to my mind, and I love what Steve said as well, but that just came to my mind straight away.
That's powerful. Thank you. I want to move on to the next question. So with the renewed conversations around violence, gun control in recent weeks with Buffalo and Uvalde, how do you talk to your adult and young children about issues of safety? And I might go first on this one, to be honest, because the day after, Buffalo, my mother-in-law was in town from the UK, and we don't, only most police don't have guns though. And only the hardest gangsters have guns. And so the culture of not having that and then hearing this, and then very quickly after that, Uvalde happened, and then my kids having to go to school the next day. That was a hard journey to school the next day. And then to think like 15 and 12-year-olds and 7-year-olds are doing exercises in school in order to hide under desks and lock rooms and stuff, is insanity. But what kind of conversation can you have? Because it's like there's no tactics you can have that resolve what's going to happen in the classroom. It's an insane situation. It's an absolutely insane situation. I don't have any wisdom to say about this, but I do have a feeling about it. And the feeling is that what needs to happen for this thing to move on? What needs to happen? And I was particularly shocked. I saw there was an incident the other day. Again, I think it was in Texas, and it looked like a camp, mostly African-American children. I believe no one was hurt. But these lunatics are going to be coming out and out again. Something has to be done, and if not now, when? So, but Chris, do you want to take this one first, and then I'll go to Steve?
Yeah, I like you, Tony. I lived in Australia, and there was they have gun control over there, and I know that's a nasty phrase to say here in America, but the murder rate, the suicide rate, all went down. I mean, 50% of all suicide are involve a firearm, and then you got the racial violence, like in Buffalo, and the kids dying. And I think until we get to a point as a country where we value the right of people's lives more so than the right of people bearing a gun, we're going to continue to have this. And I know no other way around it. The current approach we've been taking the last 10 years, where we've had more, mass killings than any other country in the world combined, it proves it's not going to work. It's not going to change. We got to find a way to change and value life more so than firearms. So that's all I can say.
Steve?
This is a tough topic for me. It hits really close to home in a lot of ways. And I don't think you could be any kind of parent and not cringe every time you hear one of these stories. Like it's senseless. Like, what kind of person would target children to shoot with weapons of war? Like I can't even put myself in that mind state to even imagine. But on the other end of the coin, that sort of behavior skews predominantly in one direction, so how do we get that addressed in that way? Like there's violence everywhere, there's always going to be violence, but going to schools and shooting them up is just, it's unconscionable. Like I can't even imagine, my kids, they get talked to at their school. They go to private school. They have to do the drills, and they have to have the conversations, and it's a tough thing to fathom that we're dropping our kids off with the thought that the next school shooting could happen at their school, because it's a predominantly young white men's game in that way, and my kids go to predominantly white schools. And if those parents are not catching the signs that one of their kids is putting these messages out on social media, They're putting the signals out, like, there's suicide signals, but there's also school shooter signals. They're always broadcasting it beforehand, and it's just uncaught because everyone thinks, not my kid would do that. No, my kid, it's just video games. It's just movies. It's just talk. But before every one of these violent school shootings, there's always some sort of broadcast. And I think we just need to call it for what it is. And parents need to just pay more attention to, and law enforcement needs to pay more attention to these messages, because these are kids. These are kids. These are not combatants in a war zone. These are young kids. Like, I can't even imagine why, I want to get off this topic, because I'm like, it hits me really, it really hits me hard. But I would just say, like, it has to end in one way or another. And parents of those kids have to pay attention to those signs, because the signs are there. It could be your kid that's thinking about shooting up a school. You have to wrestle with that and come to terms. It could be your kid that's thinking about doing something at school. It's just a fact.
Yeah.
So, and
it's a shame in 2022 we're still having this conversation, but that's the world we're in.
Uniquely American is uniquely American.
Yeah, there's so much tied up in this thing now. Like, it's a thread. When you just these wires are interconnected. It's not just about guns, it's about all sorts of stuff. And when you start detangling it, you get into some very dark conversations, which we're not going to get into today. But just, so let's talk about the next question that's come in, is who is your top father figure and why? Who do you look to? Let's start with you, Chris.
So my top father figure currently is, I'm assuming they mean current. So, it's really funny. The person I looked up to first, the first person I could think of, I got a couple. First was my father-in-law. His name was Toby. And when I came out of high school, I was the first person in my family to go to college. And to me, he embodied everything I wanted to be as a father. He was, loyal husband. He worked hard. He instilled his kids to educate themselves. He was deep in the community. He was in the civil rights. He was in the women's rights. The only thing, he was in the arts. The only thing he wasn't into was sports, and I helped him out with that. But he would be who was my idol, my father figure. As I think about in my formative years, as I think about now, wow. That's I'm scratching my head, because aside from the fictional Randall and This Is Us, I haven't even thought about it. If you can come back to me, I'll let you go, Steve.
You guys.
No, all of my father figures would most likely be fictional. So I don't have, I mean, there were plenty of, there were plenty of good fathers. One of my best friends growing up, his father, we call him Papio. He would be the equivalent of a fictional father, because he was married to the same woman for decades at a time, was there every day for his kids. So, I mean, like, other than a Bill Cosby, or, I know that's controversial to say in light of everything that happened, but just on the TV show itself, only talking about the character on TV. Cliff Huxtable, just being there, being entertaining and vulnerable for his kids, being in a successful relationship, just talking about the TV show, not the man. But all, that had a profound impact of what I thought of Black families. Because up until that point, I never saw two successful Black people on TV before. And, just seeing the way he interacted with his kids, it had a profound effect on me and the nation. So unfortunately, he tarnished that whole image. But up until that point, I think that I would have said, in terms of fictional dads, I would have put him at the top of the list.
Yeah, you got for Uncle Phil in there for Fresh Prince.
Oh, Uncle Phil, yeah.
We got Uncle Phil.
I did come up with one though, Tony. As I think about it now, having a little more time, one of the people I admire the most as a father, as a human being, and as just somebody who creates social change would be Barack Obama. I've read his books. I listened to Michelle's, read Michelle's book. It's just like the way they work as a couple, the way they work with their kids, and the way they focus on trying to always find a way to help themselves. And he goes back to help others through his MBK Foundation. That would be my answer.
Yeah, that's a powerful one. That came to my mind, but actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, there's a guy who he looks up to as a father figure, which is Michelle's dad, and he's got an amazing story. He was, for those who haven't either read the book or seen the documentary, and the way her dad worked a manual job, he was ill. He had some kind of illness, but this guy got up every day, went to work, came back every day, was with his wife the whole time, brought up these kids. Both kids, ended up in great places. We know the story. We know where that ended. The other powerful thing about him, I think, as well, was like what she said is like, he used to, though he had this manual job, when they sat at home and spoke, this guy should have been a professor somewhere. He should have been a public intellectual. But because of the times and the places he was brought up in, at that time, he just never had those opportunities. But so there are these everyday heroes. So they don't have to have been, some amazing celebrity or some amazing achiever. But we are kind of, I think sometimes my wife and I talk about this. We try to rack our brains to think about these archetypes in the real world, even in our modern life. And it's still too rare. It's still too rare. And so the question that really hits at something really important, which is to say that this top father figure thing that we hope for and dream for is not that common. And hopefully we are all the change we want to be, including everyone in this audience today. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I will say, I can't call them top father figures, but I had the unique friend group when I was in my 20s. We all had kids. And for some reason, all of my male friends, the ones that are my close friends, we all took custody of our kids. And it wasn't odd for us to have custody of our kids, but I have at least a half dozen of my friends who are single dads who raise their kids that way. So it didn't, it did not occur to me to include them, but yeah, my boys Starks and Dre, and we all have custody of our kids.
That's amazing. All right, well, we are getting towards the end. I got one other question. One of the things I read this book a while back about the different notions of parenting, that you can be a carpenter or you can be a gardener. Let me explain what these are. So a gardener is, the seed is put into the soil, and you just got to create the conditions for the seed to become what the seed was going to become. It's going to flower in some shape or form. Maybe you put a bit of support around it so it grows this way or that way, but fundamentally your job is just to let the thing become the thing it's supposed to be. You create the conditions, the climate for the child to be what the child is going to become. The carpenter is different though. So the carpenter it's got this block of wood or this piece of stone, and it's this block of wood, sorry, and then it's gonna like chisel and shape it to be the thing that it should be. Carpenter or gardener? Let's start with you, Chris.
Well, I'd say gardener because I can't hold a hammer, but I can plant seeds. But and my wife would tell you that I'm just terrible around the house. I used to be good, but I've gotten rusty. I would say a gardener because not only planting the seeds for myself and my family, but trying to find a way to plant seeds and trees for others so that they can find shade and find support. So I can not only help myself, I can find a way to create. I love Steve's comment earlier in the program about creating a legacy for his kids. And I think as a gardener, I can create a legacy by, how I grow trees and fruit and vegetables and the garden. And I just think that would allow me to do that better. So, and help me help others better. So I'd say a gardener.
And Steve?
I agree with Chris. I would I'm 80% gardener, 20% carpenter. I give them some structure as a gardener should to make sure that they plant roots and they're able to blossom and bear fruit of their own one day. But I do try to instill some. My wife and I are both Caribbean, so we also have to instill some of the cultural values that we grew up on, that we want to make sure they pass on to their kids, some of our habits and behaviors and structure. So I'm mostly gardener with a little bit of carpenter. Maybe I'll build that statue and put it in the garden. I don't know, but I'm mostly gardener. And
Do you know what? I grew up thinking I was a carpenter, but I'm becoming a gardener as the years go on. So I think I'm in the same place as you, Steve. I want to keep some of those cultural traditions going through. I don't want those to be forgotten. I think those give you strength. They're like a force field, a shield in this world. We're coming towards the end of this, but one of the things just some final thoughts, I think, for everybody out here. I think one of the themes that's come through very strongly in this conversation is this idea of conversation and vulnerability. Everybody needs somebody to talk to, and our children need us. We need ourselves. You have to love yourself before you can love others, and others love you. And one of the things I found strength in is having friends, a community of people I can talk to, I can lean on in order to be able to talk about fatherhood. So one of my best friend from back in the day, Justin Thomas Copeland, he was the first dad in our community, and he's, Justin, who runs DDB. He was the first one at the Duck, so we talk about fatherhood a lot, and I can be vulnerable with him, he can be vulnerable with me. I also am part of a community called Dope Black Dads. It started off in the UK by Marvin Harrison. We have Dope Black Dads East over here as well. And we get together and we just talk, and find a space where you can find people you can talk to. Find a space where you can be vulnerable, and you're not supposed to know the answers. No one knows the answers. You're supposed to learn the answers, and that journey never finishes. And so find that space so you can get your point of view, have confidence, and then start to have some of these conversations with your children as well. Start these rituals, start these traditions, start the genius of putting quotes in your kids' lunchbox. Start the genius of getting kids a Christmas present, but them having to give away another one. Start the genius of taking time to think about your mental health. Take the time to decide, are you a gardener or a carpenter, knowing there isn't one right answer. Take the time to look for the warning signs. Take the time to discover where your kid's mental health is, and take the time to understand that yes, you're a provider, but you're also a vulnerable, engaged, emotional human being, and that is going to bring strength to your children as well. I just want to end by just saying a big thank you to the people at Pockstock for creating this forum, this space where we could share these ideas, and for starting. I believe in the idea of tradition. So this is a tradition. This is an annual tradition now. And Pockstock, this is the third one in the series now. And so thank you for elevating the beauty and the diversity of people of color in all aspects of life. That's the core of your mission. Thank you for giving us this forum where we can talk about Black fatherhood in this way. And also, Steve, from the moment I met you, and we had an instant connection. We've been rapping ever since. It's like we've known each other like 30 years. And so your energy is infectious. Your optimism is is glowing. So thank you for this. And I don't know if you want to share any other final words, just to talk a little bit about Pockstock and its mission, because there's a bunch of people here who maybe don't know the business too well.
No, thank you for that. And thank you for this great conversation. Thanks for joining, Chris, and for everything you shared. Tony, you hosted possibly the best panel yet to date. It was very informative. I just joined last minute, but I'm happy to have stepped in. This is really part of our mission. So Pockstock, our central mission is really to showcase positive images of people of color. That could show up as stock image, but it always can show up as positive images of Black dads, telling their stories to counterbalance all of the stereotypes that you've heard about Black fathers over the years. I am a strong believer that if you don't come from a rich family must come from you. And this is how we build legacy for each other through enterprises like PocStock, through the work that Tony's doing with the Black and Brilliant Network, through the work that Chris is doing with the defensive line. This is how we build legacy for our kids to make their lives better than our lives was, and their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. So I would just want to thank everybody for watching and tuning in, and make sure to support all of these worthy Black organizations as we move into Juneteenth weekend, and happy Father's Day to everyone. But make sure to support those Black dads. Tag your images with Black Dad Challenge all weekend, and we'll showcase them on our platforms. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Steve. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Take care. Great job.
People of color are often underrepresented in media. PocStock is changing that. Join us in capturing the faces and culture of Black, Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Natives. Are you a rockstar photographer? Sign up on our website to submit content and receive royalties. PocStock, focusing on people of color.